The soap carving of mandibular first premolar follows the same technique as the carving of the central first maxillary incisor. Again, the key for successful soap carving of the tooth is to make the outlines of the tooth proper. That means you have to make perfect draw on the soap and then to carve the soap away from these outlines. I've already drawn the medial side of the mandibular first premolar. It's easy for me to start with the medial or the distal side, it doesn't matter, and to put the VL width of the crown because it's easy to place the equator, the widest part of each side, on the right spot. As you can see, the equator of the mandibular premolar on the vestibular side lies down near the cervix. About the lingual side, the equator is a little bit in the upper third of the lingual side. It's not so close to the cervix as it is on the vestibular side. And the cervix itself follow one groove which is curved and orientated to the crown. I put the complete length of the tooth, the crown length, then I measure the VL, the vestibulolingual diameter of the crown, and marked here, and the VL diameter of the cervix and marked here as well. By putting these measurements, I draw a box in which I put the outlines of the tooth. The same thing, the same measurements from the chart which we used when we make the teeth drawings, and the same drawing as the medial side of the tooth. Here is just turned the opposite way. Now I'm going to carve a 0.5 millimeters or 1 millimeter away from this border, and then I'm going to put the MD diameters of the crown and the cervix, and I'm going to draw here the vestibular side of the tooth. First I removed the big axis of the soap, and now I'm going to carve away from the borders very carefully, because you know, if a crack appeared somewhere in the drawing, basically this soap will be useful. Okay, very gently carving. Follow the borders and make straight cuts in the depth of the soap. Here in the cervical area I marked it. Now I'm trying to carve very gently here where the occlusal side of the tooth will be placed. I'm trying to follow the grooves to cut it the same way. You can cut the soap on small parts, not so big, for example, like this, if you are afraid of cracking. On small pieces. Again, I'm following the outlines of the drawings which I put on the soap at first. I'm just carving a little bit deeper here in the cervix, just to underline where is the cervix, but I do not carve deep in the soap. Now I have to cut the soap around the root, and I will continue by fining a little bit this shape. Okay, so far we have this shape. It's not finished, it's not ready. Now I'm going to put here the MD diameters for the vestibular side of the crown, and I'm going to draw the outlines of the vestibular side of the crown and the root as well. Before shaping the vestibular side, I would like to say something about the medial and distal side, which is important for the designing of the occlusal side of the tooth. I think that it's visible here, this midline, which I first put when I put the measurements about the length of the crown and the root and VL diameters. I first put here one midline. As you can see, the tip of the cusp basically is it lies on the midline, and the occlusal side is a little bit aware of the midline. Here will be the occlusal side. The lingual cusp is smaller and it's shorter than the vestibular cusp, and the vestibular side is tilted to the lingual side of the tooth, to the oral cavity. Imagine here is the lingual side, and this is the oral cavity where the tongue is placed. On the drawing here is the same. There is one midline and the tip of the cusp is on the midline. The occlusal side is placed basically on the lingual side of the tooth, and the vestibular side is tilted to the lingual direction. Now I'm going to put here the MD diameters, but again I'm going to put one midline because it would be easy for me to draw the picture on it. Just one straight midline, Now the MD diameter of the crown is 20.1 millimeters. Okay, 20.1 is here. And the MD width of the cervix is about 14.7. Let's say 15. Now I'm going to draw the vestibular side here. Now it's the time to decide whether this would be left or right tooth, because the medial section of the cusp is shorter than the distal section of the cusp. This has to be visible. I prefer my tooth to be 4-4. It means mandibular first premolar and the patient's right. This is the medial section of the cusp. This is the distal section of the cusp. Here I mark the crown, the cervix, excuse me, ovoid shape, and the cervix is curved to the root now. Here is curved to the crown. On the vestibular and the lingual side is curved to the root. Now I marked here the distal side of section of the cusp, the medial section of the cusp. Here is the cervix, and now I'm going to connect them. Okay. I hope it's visible that the outlines of the crown are placed in the center of this side of the soap. The medial side section of the cusp, the distal, and converging medial and distal sections of the crown. This shape here, the vestibular. Now I'm going to draw the outlines of the crown. As you can see, the crown starts from the cervix. It has the same diameter as the cervix. Something important. I was speaking about tooth 4-4, but without thinking, I put the medial section here and the distal here. That means this tooth is not 4-4, it's 3-4. It's mandibular left premolar, not right. This is important. I would like to clarify it. Please make the root straight at first. It's easy to carve a little bit here in the apical third when all the tooth is ready. Do not carve too much. Do not make the apical third thinner, very thin. Okay, now I'm going to carve the excess of the soap the same way as I did with the medial side. Very, very gently, according to the drawing. When I cut according to the drawing, I automatically make the right inclination of every side. the medial and the distal side converges. That means they meet somewhere. If you continue their path, they're going to meet somewhere here where the root is. Convergate to the root direction and divergate to the crown. This is important. When I cut according to this drawing of the vestibular side, I automatically creating this here. Now I'm going to cut the medial side, the medial section of the cusp, the distal section of the cusp. Okay. Now the root. As I said before, the width of the root is the same as the width of the cervix. My recommendation is do not carve too much in the cervix from the beginning. Just make one small groove, one mark where the cervix has to be placed, and try not to move lower or upper this groove. Carve the root straighter as well, and tilt it the apical third when you're almost ready with the carving of the soap, of the tooth. The lingual side of the tooth is smaller and thinner than the vestibular side. That means this is the lingual side. We have to cut from here and here as well to make this lingual side thinner than the medial side. And it's important to smooth all the ridges, all the borders between the vestibular side and the medial and distal side, between the lingual side and the medial and distal side as well, this way, because otherwise the tooth looks very sharp and it's not the right shape it has to be. Now the lingual side starts to look thinner than the vestibular one, but it needs more. I'm working only of the vestibular, lingual and medial and distal side of the outlines of the tooth. I am not starting here, the occlusal side. I want to make the right way, make the right design of the outlines, and then to continue with the occlusal side. I flatten a little bit here, but only here. I do not carve the equator, the widest part of the tooth, of the each side. I will show you how it has to look like. Look how tilted is the vestibular side, but the equator remains here in the cervical third of the tooth, the widest part. About the lingual side, the equator is here, near the occlusal side. Tilted, but the equator is here. The widest part of the vestibular side is here. From the palate side is here. When you look the tooth from the lingual side, this cusp, the lingual cusp and the lingual side as well, are thinner than the vestibular side. This is important about the shape of the crown. I make the root thinner a little bit here because when the lingual side is thinner than the vestibular, the lingual part of the root is thinner as well. Okay, now, how to design the occlusal side? We have one palate cusp and one vestibular cusp. This is the tip of the cusp. I'm going to mark the inner ridge, and I'm going to cut according to this ridge. I can mark it a little bit here on the vestibular side as well. The vestibular cusp should have the shape of the pyramid with 4 walls, 2 walls here and 2 walls here. I marked here the inner ridge, and now I'm going to cut the slope of the cusp. I left one ridge and I make slopes, the inner slopes of the cusps, which of the vestibular cusp, which are not straight line, they're angled. I hope that it's visible. This here, angled. Now, as I marked here this ridge, which will be this one. I'm going to cut a little bit from the vestibular side as well. Again, to design the pyramid shape of the cusp. Very gently carving. Do not carve the equator. It's mandatory to keep the equator. Smooth the ridges, otherwise the tooth wouldn't look natural. But do not carve from the equator, please. The equators are very important because they protect the gingiva, otherwise the gingiva will be very damaged during the masticatory process because the food will stuck in the gingival margin and the gum will be inflamed all the time. That's why it's important to have good equators, very well designed. Again, smooth the ridges to look natural. Now the vestibular cusp is already done. Of course, there is a corrections which have to be make, but I'll leave that for the end. Now we have to design the medial and the distal pit, the central groove, and the lingual cusp as well. The lingual cusp is shorter and thinner than the vestibular one, and just we have to smooth it to make. Now when I'm almost ready with the lingual cusp, I'm going to design the medial and distal pit. I'm just cutting triangles. This is the medial distal